Faulty fuse. Chapter 8. Now that Labor Day had come and gone, everyone seemed ready to get down to business. The presidential candidates began officially announcing their campaigns and crisscrossing the country in variously themed tours. Bremen was headlining a Back to the Basics bus tour. Spearham had launched her Conversations caravan. Rexford was riding high astride his Momentum motorcycles, and Y had unleashed his Cajun Express. As I read about them all, I daydreamed about a giant drag race that could decide the nomination. It would have to take place somewhere open and flat, where people could really get down and dirty, maybe Kansas. And even though Conrad and Candle weren't doing as well, they could participate in the vehicles of their choosing, because we were a democracy after all. The drag race would definitely speed up the primary season and inject a little more excitement into it. And maybe it could woo the NASCAR dads back into the party fold. Those pesky dads were currently enamored with the other side, where Brantzy was continuing to pick up steam and far outpole the president's brother and the Senate Majority Leader. Not to be outdone by any of his potential rivals for the general election, Brantzy had just taken off on a freedom fly-around. I wondered if his route took him over Kansas. He could fly right over the drag race. Would he trail a taunting banner from his plane? Or engage in some skywriting smack talk? My daydreaming did a lot to spice up the morning news summaries. On the Hill, people were ready to get back down to business as well. Over the summer recess, plenty of constituents had made it clear that they were fed up with Congress's sluggish pace and were prepared to express their frustrations via the ballot box. In response, chastised lawmakers returned to D.C., hell-bent on getting things done. This palpable enthusiasm for productivity bode well for the prescription drug benefit bill. I hope the legislation could ride the wave before it broke on any ideological sandbars and dispersed into stagnant partisan tide pools. Timing would be everything. A companion piece of legislation was making its way through the House of Representatives. If the House succeeded in passing their version the same week the Senate approved our bill, the two could go immediately into a conference committee that would iron out their differences. Then, of course, the agreed-upon identical bill would have to pass both the House and Senate before it could be delivered to the Oval Office, where President Pyle was already actively rooting against it. Though Pyle had stopped short of vowing a veto, since even he could sense that such a move would be politically unwise, his administration was working furiously behind the scenes to guarantee that their congressional henchmen killed the bill off quickly. We were working just as furiously to ensure the final bill could be made into law before Congress adjourned for the year, which gave us a little over 2 months. I felt energized by the challenge. Though the bill fell short of my initial hopes for the legislation, I'd come around to the belief that it still represented positive steps in the right direction, and it was great to feel forward momentum. However, working with the Bremen crew continued to test my patience. They were consistently arrogant and bossy, and I'd grown to dread our joint strategy meetings. Aaron wasn't involved in these, but I still held him accountable for being associated with such a terrible group of people. And in my opinion, Aaron had let slip enough comments to prove that he shared their basic condescension. He swore that I had misrepresented these, but I knew I hadn't. Aaron had listened to my charges, reiterated how much he respected the work I did, and started making me breakfast most mornings as atonement for being part of the Bremen staff. Lucky for him, I'd forgive almost anything for a steady supply of pancakes, though I warned him that he would have to change jobs soon if we were to progress as a couple. He nodded and added chocolate chips to the batter that morning. At work, I fell easily into the new routine of lobbying and strategizing. Every day we updated a large chart that indicated how the relevant lawmakers were most inclined to vote on the bill based on whatever new information we'd managed to gather. The second week of September, we got an unexpected publicity boost with the release of 2 separate studies from well-respected institutions that claim that a government-funded healthcare system like the one currently in place in Canada would save the United States $200 billion a year, which was more than enough money to cover the costs of the nearly 44 million Americans currently without health insurance. The articles about the studies invariably cited the prescription drug benefit proposal as America's attempt to move closer to such a progressive system. As I sifted through this beneficial coverage, I was briefly distracted by a distressingly fawning story about Borden Dent, actor turned presidential aspirant. Dent had been parading around in his Prada cowboy boots from one press conference to the next, signing autographs and flashing his trademark smile. He'd portrayed a president twice in the movies and often pointed to these parts as great preparation for the job he sought. He'd also played a psychotic alien, giant ape, and a retarded man with a bad southern accent, but I had yet to hear him touting the learning experiences of these roles. There was still time. I was clicking out of the Borden Dent article and back into the bill work when a breaking news alert informed me that a rolling blackout had just left Cleveland and Toledo powerless. I turned on the TV and watched the footage. There were hordes of disrupted commuters wandering on foot in a sort of aimless weave down the middle of streets rendered disorderly by defunct traffic lights. Where did our rules go without electricity? Apparently they got absorbed into some sort of primitive hive mind that emerged to fill the void left by the abrupt disappearance of the manufactured power we come to rely so heavily upon. Anchormen warned that looting might begin at nightfall. Until then, the city seemed ruled by a steaming sense of purposelessness. A quick-thinking power grid monitor had apparently acted in time to prevent the blackout from spreading to the eastern seaboard, sparing millions the stress and frustration currently befalling the residents of Ohio. The preliminary reports indicated the blackout hadn't been caused by any individual company's negligence, but was more a casualty of the grossly outdated power grid that RG had been warning about for some time. I learned early on that RG was better than most at seeing the bigger picture, and was occasionally ridiculed for it by those who made their careers out of capitalizing on smaller, safer political issues. RG wasn't a doomsayer. He always had a proactive plan for combating the problems he pointed to. But his detractors wrote him off as a pessimistic exaggerator. The fact that he'd been proven right time and time again, they refused to address or accept. RG immediately called for more hearings on the topic before getting on a plane to Ohio to tour the hospitals, water plants, and community centers, and offer whatever support and assistance he could provide. I spent the rest of the day updating the position chart and helping answer the hundreds of calls swamping the office lines. By dinner time, I was short of breath from talking to so many people, worried about loved ones they hadn't yet heard from. I also felt dizzy and lightheaded, the beginning signs of a panic attack. Some people got sympathy pains. I got sympathy disorders. Thankfully, power returned to northern Ohio sometime during the night, before too much damage had been done. RG completed his tour and rejoined us on the hill, where the rest of the week blazed by in a caffeinated blur of blackout recovery and bill lobbying. The surprise crisis had served to double our normal workload, but I'd learned to expect the unexpected in this job and simply adjust my schedule accordingly. As I headed into the office that Saturday to make my way through a stack of paperwork, I noted that it was the 65th anniversary of Seabiscuit's win over War Admiral at Pimlico. To celebrate, I ducked into a corner store and bought some scratch tickets adorned with horses, which ended up winning me a free Slurpee. I chose the cherry-flavored kind and arrived at work a little hyper from all the sugar. Mark was also in the office, looking a bit stressed. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I asked. "RG may be doing Russert tomorrow," he answered, making talking signs with his hands. Interesting. That was great, if a little surprising. Brayman had been sucking up most of the press oxygen around the bill, relegating RG to a lower profile, but very crucial lobbying role. As I watched Mark walk quickly away, I realized that I hadn't seen much of him in the last few weeks, which was abnormal since our office was not that large. He used to come up with any excuse to shyly wander past my desk, but now it was almost as though he'd been purposely avoiding me. 2 hours later, he appeared beside my desk. "Listen, Sammy," he began, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you for a little while now." "Sure, Mark, go for it," I replied. "Well, you know when you have something you need to say, but you're pretty sure the other person isn't going to want to hear it? That's sort of what I've been struggling with," he continued laboriously. Oh gosh, what was this? I noticed his hands had remained uncharacteristically motionless throughout his speech. I said cautiously. "Well, I think I already know the answer to this, but, are you and Aaron exclusive? There's a reason I'm asking." Oh no, I already knew the reason, but did we really have to talk about it? Weren't we past this? I couldn't deal with the vocalized crush from Mark. His feelings for me had been obvious all along. Well, at least since Mona had pointed them out to me. Didn't he know there wasn't any chance of us getting together? Having been on the other end of painfully unrequited crushes more times than I'd like to count, I had no desire to be the person stringing someone else along. I liked Mark and was annoyed that he seemed determined to make things permanently uncomfortable between us. I took a deep breath. I needed to put an end to this as definitively as I could, while still being kind. "Yeah, we are, Mark. Look, I really like working with you and think you're a cool person, but you've got to move on. There are plenty of other women who'd be tremendously lucky to date you. Possibly 1 or 2 of them right here in this very office. But not me. I'm with Aaron, and I don't think we should talk any more about it, okay?" I had involuntarily closed my eyes somewhere in the middle of my spiel, as though I didn't want to watch it unfold. It was certainly easier to get through when I didn't have to look at Mark's face. Now that I had opened my eyes, I saw that his skin had turned a deep pink color, and he looked supremely embarrassed. Ooh, I should have kept them closed. "That's not what I was gonna... Never mind," he stammered. "Just forget I was gonna say anything. It was a bad idea," he said as he hurried off. Alright, that was agonizing but necessary. Mark had needed to be disavowed of any lingering romantic illusions. I hoped we could be friends, but even if we couldn't, at least there wouldn't be any misunderstanding between us. I returned to my work with a resigned resolve. I made it back home by 4 o'clock, which helped me feel like I hadn't really put in a full day of work on the weekend. Any time before 7 o'clock didn't count as a full day. When I walked in the front door, Shackleton was suspended diagonally, facing downwards in his fishbowl. His gills were beating sluggishly, indicating some slivers of remaining life, but I had just about enough. I used my special Crime Corner camera to snap a Polaroid of his latest death pose and marched the evidence down to Mr. Lee's pet store. "You didn't flush him yet?" Mr. Lee asked in horror as I presented the photo. Oh, right. The last Mr. Lee had heard, Shackleton had perished months ago. No, I wasn't keeping him around Norman Bates style. I wrinkled my nose at the thought of the smell. No, he's alive, but just barely, I clarified. I know I said he was dead on that message, but it turned out he wasn't. He just pretends to be dead all the time. It's very disconcerting. I need something to make him better. Mr. Lee looked thoughtful and concerned for a few moments. "Oh, stop presses. I have just thought of something," he cried, his face lighting up. Come look, come look." I followed him back to the fish tank section, where I glanced bitterly at a slew of hale and hearty-looking Japanese fighting fish. Shackleton had once looked similarly sneakily healthy. Mr. Lee pointed to a corner of their tank, specifically at some bright purple seaweed. "Just in," he exclaimed. "You must try it. Make all the difference." "How much is it?" I asked suspiciously. "For you? Preferred customer? A special deal," he answered. Back at home and $20 later, I cleaned Shackleton's bowl and refilled it with the seaweed remedy. But when I returned him to his hangout, he went straight to the bottom to lie down on the rocks. Completely ignoring the new addition. Maybe he just needed a little while to notice it. I wasn't ready to give up hope just yet. I had plans to meet Aaron later that evening, once he finished drafting a speech Brayman was scheduled to give at the AFL-CIO convention. He'd been working at Brayman's Georgetown townhouse since early morning, but expected to be released in time for dinner, as the senator and his wife had symphony plans. Even though I'd also had to work on a Saturday, I felt resentful that Aaron's irksome job continued to cut into our together time. I wouldn't have minded as much were he working for a cause I deemed worthy, but that wasn't the case. And he'd been traveling so much lately, our relationship had begun to resemble a commuter one. The only upshot of this tense arrangement was that it made me really value the nights we set aside to be alone together. I'd read somewhere that successful marriages often depended on such date night strategies, so perhaps this was all good practice for the future. I took a hot shower and a long time getting ready, in happy anticipation of the evening. He finally blackberried around 8 o'clock. To Samantha Joyce, srjoyce@gary.senate.gov. From Aaron Driver, aidriver@brayman.senate.gov. Subject: why aren't you with me right now? Text: lovely Lady Riley, we're at the Tombs. Up for it? The Tombs was a Georgetown bar in Georgetown. In other words, a very collegey bar. But it was fun when it wasn't too crowded, and it served kick-ass jalapeno poppers that I developed a mild addiction to my first few months in D.C. I was a little confused as to who the we was and why the we was at a bar when I had been killing time uncontacted for the last few hours, but I decided to just put on some lipstick and head over. I'd find out soon enough. I should have known when I got thrown up on, before I even made it into the bar, that it wasn't going to be a good evening. It happened just as I reached the steep flight of steps that led down into the tombs. 2 young guys were propping up a third cohort between them as they made their staggering way to the street. I caught a glimpse of their Lord's greenish face just as his tortured eyes met mine, and he blanketed my upper torso in a sloppy coat of vomit. It was less gross than it could have been, since my projectile barfer had apparently only consumed massive amounts of alcohol in the last several hours, translating into a purely liquid attack. Still, it wasn't that fun. I stood there dripping for a moment as my assailant beamed an apology from his miserable eyes before stumbling off towards his dorm. My cab driver, who'd been counting his tips after letting me off, quickly swerved down the street, lest I try to get back in for a trip home for fresh clothes. Apparently, my puke-covered money was no longer good enough for him. I examined my options. To hail another cab, get home, change and return could take up to an hour with Saturday night traffic and wardrobe indecision. Taking the subway was not an option, as the city planners had annoyingly neglected to put a train stop in Georgetown. It hadn't been an oversight. They had allegedly bowed to pressure from the wealthy upper-crust residents who wanted to insulate their territory from too much contact with the hoi polloi. The most elite parts of democracy's capital city were the most difficult to access. At the moment, I found this irony incredibly inconvenient. I called Liza for a consultation. "You have to go home. That's disgusting, Sammy." "But it already took me a while to get here, and I really just want to..." "Sammy..." Liza didn't use her stern tone that often. She reserved it for when serious etiquette crimes were about to be committed. "All right, fine. I'll call you later." I hung up, resigned to trudge down to M Street to try and hail a cab. But it had already been 45 minutes since I'd gotten Aaron's message to come meet him, so I at least wanted to pop in and inform him of what was going on with me. Surely he cared. On the other hand, as Liza had emphasized, I was covered in gross vomit and not looking so hot. Perhaps I'd just BlackBerry. To Aaron Driver, AI driver at Bremen.senate.gov. From Samantha Joyce, SR Joyce at Gary.senate.gov. Subject, why aren't you with me right now? Text, currently right outside the tombs, but have had an accident, not of my own doing, I swear. Must return home to change. Want to come with? Sammy. I sat down on the steps to wait for his response, which I felt confident would entail his momentary appearance by my side. After 10 minutes and 3 different people asking their friends, "What do you think happened to her?" I still hadn't heard from him. What the hell was he doing? Hadn't he gotten my message? Who or what was more important than responding immediately? I stormed down the stairs, stopping in the bathroom to clean myself up a little bit before making my way angrily to the bar. I found him there doing tequila shots with a group of people, several of whom I recognized as Bremen staffers. The fact that Aaron worked with them was irritating enough. Must he willingly socialize with them too? I felt myself scowling. "Sammy," he shouted after I tugged on his elbow. "We need one more shot," he shouted at the bartender. "No thanks," I said through gritted teeth. I'd been doused with enough drinks for one night. Didn't he notice I needed some non-alcoholic assistance? "Did you get my BlackBerry?" I inquired, completely ignoring the people around us. I didn't like them anyway. "Huh?" he asked, straining to hear, but not too hard. He was definitely drunk. The place was pretty packed, which was certainly not the way I'd liked it. I'd enjoyed the sweaty, frantic feel of college bars when I'd been in college, but now it just made me tense. "Hey, what happened to you?" he asked when he finally really noticed me. "Some guy threw up on me," I answered. "That's gross." He paused to let this sink in. "But what I meant was, where have you been? We've been here since 3:30. He clarified, if it was possible to clarify while slurring one's words. 3:30 that afternoon? I'd still been at the office then. I assumed he'd still been working also. Okay, deep breath. Maintain calm. "You didn't get in touch with me until 8 o'clock, so I haven't been here because I didn't know you were here," I said, trying to keep my voice as unshrill as possible. "Huh? Sorry. Thought I buried you earlier. It must not have gone through." "Uh-huh." He looked unfocused. Still hot in a hazy way, but definitely out of it. I was jealous of the people he'd been hanging out with, and annoyed that Aaron hadn't called me sooner. Why didn't he want me to hang out? Why didn't he want to hang out with me? Wasn't I fun? What wasn't fun about me? Alright, maybe there were some unfun things about me at this exact moment, but they could be explained away. "Well, I'm glad you guys have been having such a party," I said in a tone that indicated I wasn't at all pleased by that fact. "I hate to break it up, but I've got to go home. Are you coming with me?" Even as I said it, I knew it was a bad move. If I was out partying with my friends, would I want to stop the good times to appease a spew-covered harpy who'd done nothing but yell at me since arriving on the scene? Probably not. But, I argued in my head, what if that spew-covered harpy was a significant other whom I cared for very much, possibly even loved? Didn't that change the equation? I decided not to dwell on the question of why I'd be dating a spew-covered harpy in the first place. I was still working through my feelings on the subject when Aaron batted at my arm. "Come on, don't be mad. Say have some fun with us." He grinned beseechingly at me. "I'll find you some new clothes." "Hey, you!" he shouted at a guy wearing a Hoyas t-shirt and balancing 2 pitchers of beer on a stack of cups as he passed by. "I'll give you $20 for your t-shirt," Aaron said as he took out his wallet. "I'm leaving, Aaron," I said pointedly. "Wait, baby, I'm gonna get this for you so you don't have to go home and change," he explained as he tugged on the stranger's sleeve. "Dude, get off me," the Hoyas guy yelled, flinging out his elbow and pushing Aaron into a table. "What's your problem?" Aaron shouted after him. Then he looked at me and started laughing. "Sorry, baby, hold on, I'll ask someone else," he promised. I grabbed his arm as he made a beeline for a large man wearing a sweaty underwear tank top. I didn't view that as a big improvement over my current outfit, and it certainly wasn't an item of clothing worth $20, or a beating. Stop, Aaron, I urged. Forget it. I don't want someone else's shirt. He looked at me perplexed. I realized that he was nowhere close to sober enough to understand me at the moment. I might as well save my wrath for when it could have a greater impact. If you're having such a fantastic time here, why don't you just stay? I suggested bitterly. Okay, sounds good. Bye, baby. Aaron agreed much too quickly. Stunned, I watched him return to the Brayman posse at the bar. A few of them looked over their shoulders in my direction, but I ignored them, held my chin up high, and made my sodden way through the hordes of drunken college students towards the stairway and up to the street. I passed the exorcist house on my journey to a cab, and mused the coincidence of being covered in vomit so close to that landmark of cinematic puke. Had my attacker been possessed by Satan? I hadn't noticed any visible head spinning, but who knew what was happening back at his dorm? I had just made it to M Street and into an even greater rage over Aaron's behavior when I heard someone call my name. When I turned around, I found myself face to face with Charlie Lawton, evil enemy. I flinched backwards, a look of repulsion etched on my face. Combined with my stinky, sopping outfit, I imagined this made for an outstandingly atrocious look. He did appear concerned. "Hold on a second," he yelled to a man down the street. Apparently he'd just run over to flag me down. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked. Did he really need to ask? I clearly wasn't, and there was no way that I was going to be any better after running into him. His fake concern sickened me. "As if you care," I spat at him. "Are we off the record? Or should I just lie and tell you I'm fantastic?" Strategically, I should have waited to hear his answer about being off the record before providing him the sarcastic alternative. If we were in fact on the record, I'd just given up some information. I made a note to myself for future hostile interactions with journalists. He looked a bit taken aback. "Look, I'm sure you're upset about the article. I wanted to talk to you to what? Get a follow-up on whether I'd been fired or not." I began furiously, hailing a cab. "I'm still employed, no thanks to you. You're a real jerk, you know." I couldn't decipher his expression, mainly because my hair had fallen uncooperatively into my face. Even though I couldn't see him, I hoped he looked hurt and chastened. "Can I help get you a cab?" he asked soberly. "No, I don't want a cab," I shouted with my hands still outstretched in a hailing a cab gesture. "Go to hell." I put my hand down and stomped determinedly off. In the reflection of an opening restaurant door, I saw him impassively staring at me as I stalked away. Good riddance. My feet were sore, and I was thoroughly chilled by the time I made it an appropriate distance away to be able to hail a cab. The ride was fast and bumpy, and the tears had started flowing before I made it to my front door. I turned on my light and blearily took in Shackleton wrapped up in the seaweed. He wasn't moving in his noose-like cocoon, but I was too upset to go in for a closer examination. I opted instead to take a bath while I continued sobbing. I replayed the night's events in my head over and over. In retrospect, it felt like I'd never stopped getting puked on. I really didn't want to be the sort of woman who got shrewish and possessive and yelled at her potential fiancé when he was just out blowing off steam. I imagined that when one worked for an enormous jerk, blowing off steam was important. But Aaron had also blown off our plans I'd been looking forward to, plans I'd spent an hour getting ready for. He'd treated me badly, hadn't he? Or was I overreacting? I wasn't sure. And I felt exhausted by all the second-guessing. As for Charlie Lawton, I only wished I hadn't looked quite so haggard or smelled quite so offensive when I told him off. He unquestionably deserved my venomous scorn, and I felt no remorse having flung it at him. If he felt even a little bad about himself, it had been worth it. I'd investigate Shackleton's status in the morning. I left a message for Zelda, but refrained from calling Liza, whom I knew was now with Ryan at some sort of horrible fraternity reunion of his. I decided to meditate to further relax, and was subsequently dead asleep in a matter of minutes, unaware of exactly where I stood on my journey towards enlightenment.